My name is Kelsey Donovan, and I never thought my quiet life in Chicago would tilt on its axis because of a single notification on my phone. It came right after a double shift, my legs heavy and numb, my scrub still holding the artificial warmth of hospital lights. When my credit card app lit up, I almost dismissed it as a glitch, the kind that happens when you're overtired and barely thinking straight. But the number on the screen didn't blur or change when I blinked. $15,000, a luxury cruise I hadn't booked, a trip I hadn't even known existed. The moment I traced the charge back to my own family, something inside me settled into place with a cold, unmistakable certainty. I had spent years absorbing smaller blows without protest. Emergency expenses that somehow never applied to me. Favors that weren't requests but expectations. Responsibilities handed to me before I understood their weight. But this wasn't a favor. This wasn't confusion or carelessness. It was a statement delivered without apology. Your life matters less than ours. When I confronted him, he laughed. Not the awkward laugh of someone caught off guard, not the uneasy sound of guilt. He laughed like it was amusing, like $15,000 was insignificant, like I was insignificant. It's not like you ever travel anyway. In that instant, everything inside me went quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I said one sentence, four calm words that closed the door on the version of me they expected to exist forever. Enjoy your trip. And while they packed their bags and stepped onto that ship, I was already mapping out what would come next. None of them saw it coming. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me what time it is for you right now and where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story will travel. The hours that followed unfolded with an unusual sharpness, as though my mind had finally stopped resisting what it had always known. I couldn't explain why everything felt more defined, only that the shift had already happened and there was no pulling back from it. Growing up in Chicago taught me early that some families run on rules no one ever explains, and mine had perfected those systems long before I had words for them. My father believed authority worked best when it came without conversation. My mother softened the edges, turning compliance into something that looked like care. Between them, I learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken and to absorb strain quietly so the household could keep moving. I didn't think of it as sacrifice then. I thought it was simply what I was supposed to do. By the time I was old enough to work, my role was already defined. Part-time jobs after school turned into year-round commitments, and the money I earned rarely stayed mine. There was always another bill, another oversight, another expense that somehow became my responsibility. When Faith needed new clothes or a ride across town, I rearranged my schedule. When my father misplaced his wallet, my hand moved to mine without being asked. None of it felt abnormal because it had always been this way. College was supposed to loosen those patterns, at least in theory. I enrolled in a healthcare program, built my class schedule around long nights and patient transport, and told myself independence would come with a degree. Instead, the same demands followed me: overdue insurance payments, sudden car repairs, school costs for Faith that slipped my mother's mind. I handled it all quietly, believing that silence kept everything stable. People called me dependable, and I wore the label proudly because it allowed me to ignore what sat beneath it. After graduation, I accepted a hospital position on Chicago's West Side and lived tightly until I could afford a down payment on a small house. Signing those papers felt monumental, like the first adult decision that belonged entirely to me. I imagined weekends without obligations, evenings where quiet didn't mean responsibility. The house was meant to symbolize a life shaped by my choices. That illusion didn't last long. My parents' rental situation collapsed faster than expected, and urgency arrived disguised as inevitability. They didn't ask to move in. They presented it as the only logical solution. I told myself it would be temporary. Weeks turned into months, and the boundaries I hoped would protect my independence dissolved before I noticed they were gone. Faith claimed the guest room without hesitation. My mother adjusted shared spaces as if reclaiming something misplaced. Soon, the house felt less like mine, and more like an extension of the home I believed I had outgrown. As my shifts stacked and sleep came in fragments, the imbalance deepened. My father treated my income as communal. My mother reframed every demand as necessity. Faith drifted through her days untouched by consequence. I convinced myself that staying quiet was easier than facing the questions that would surface if I didn't. Denial was comfortable, and I held on to it far longer than I should have. Looking back, the signs were impossible to miss. The erosion of privacy, the steady withdrawal from my sense of self, the unspoken certainty that I would always carry what no one else wanted to hold. These weren't new developments. They were the continuation of a lifetime of conditioning, tightened so gradually I stopped feeling the pressure. But awareness, once it settles in, doesn't leave. By the next morning, the truth pressed in with a clarity I could no longer avoid. The life I thought I was managing had become a structure held together by obligations that were never meant to be mine. My name was on the deed, yet I barely existed in the space. The house that was supposed to represent independence functioned without me. Most nights I slept in a rented studio near the hospital, exhausted from irregular hours, while the home I paid for carried on as if I were a guest. I mentioned pieces of my situation to Amber, a coworker who noticed things without needing full explanations. Her quiet disbelief made it impossible to pretend this was normal anymore. That realization followed me through the day, lingering between tasks and resurfacing whenever I paused long enough to breathe. I kept returning to the same question: what was truly mine and what had been placed on my shoulders until I mistook it for responsibility? By the end of my shift, I needed facts, not guilt. I scheduled a legal consultation about property rights, expecting complications. Instead, the answer was simple. The house was legally mine. No lease, no rent, no shared ownership. The boundaries I thought were fixed were entirely mine to change. The silence that followed wasn't empowering at first. It was grief, the kind that comes from realizing how long you've lived inside something that diminished you. But grief made room for clarity. With that clarity, the next steps formed naturally. I researched timelines, evaluated options, and moved deliberately. Endurance, I realized, was never the same as strength. Stepping away required far more courage. I contacted a local real estate agent whose reputation emphasized efficiency and professionalism. Her name was Brooke Carter. When she returned my message, her calm, direct tone steadied something in me. We scheduled a walkthrough for later that week, during a window when my family would be away. The timing didn't feel cruel. It felt necessary. By the day of the walkthrough, a steadiness had settled in me, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made long before it's spoken. I met Brooke Carter outside the house, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her demeanor composed. She treated the moment as routine, and that normalcy brought unexpected relief. When I unlocked the door, the quiet click echoed more than it should have. Stepping inside, I felt the familiar divide between ownership and displacement. Brooke moved ahead with practiced efficiency, noting structural details, assessing the layout, recording features that would matter to buyers. I watched her work without directing her. Attention anywhere specific, the house would speak for itself, though not in the ways she might expect. In the living room, the walls carried framed moments. That did not include me, family photos, arranged with deliberate symmetry, yet none acknowledged the person who paid for the space that held them. It wasn't the absence that stung, but the certainty that it had been intentional. My presence had been edited out of a home I created. Brooke made a few observations about lighting and furniture placement, unaware of the quiet ache beneath the surface. I didn't interrupt. Her focus was practical, unclouded by emotion, and I needed that contrast. We moved down the hallway. She opened the first bedroom door, and for a moment I felt disoriented. The space no longer resembled anything connected to me. My sister had transformed it into elaborate dressing room, racks of clothing arranged by color, shoes lined in rows, a vanity covered in palettes and brushes. Nothing hinted that another life had existed here before hers. Standing in that doorway, I understood with final clarity how thoroughly I had been pushed to the margins. Brooke paused long enough to jot a few notes, her expression neutral but attentive. She likely saw only an overfilled room that would need decluttering, yet to me, it felt like a summary of years I hadn't allowed myself to evaluate. In the primary bedroom, my parents' belongings filled every corner with an ease that suggested permanence rather than necessity. Their routines had imprinted themselves on the space, replacing any trace of the temporary arrangement we once agreed upon. Drawers were full, surfaces crowded, closets overflowing. Nothing about their presence hinted at transition or humility. They lived here, as though the roots had been planted by someone else and I was merely passing through. Brooke continued her walkthrough, discussing comparable properties in the Chicago area, estimated listing ranges, and the pace at which similar homes moved on the market. Her tone remained steady, professional, unburdened. It grounded me more than I expected. The practical world she described, the world of contracts, offers, inspections, felt entirely separate from the emotional weight of What I was confronting, we stepped into. The kitchen last, this room more than. The others carried the history of every bill I paid without acknowledgement. Appliances I selected were coated with fingerprints that weren't mine. The pantry was stocked with groceries I never ate, even the refrigerator held reminders of a life I had funded but never lived. When Brooke closed her folder, she looked at me with the calm assurance of someone who had guided many owners through similar decisions. The market, she said, was strong, the house would draw interest quickly, the process could begin the moment I confirmed I was ready. I didn't hesitate, clarity had been building for longer than I cared to admit. Standing in the kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a life I had financed yet been excluded from, the choice required no further deliberation. I told her to proceed with the listing. The listing went live sooner than I expected, and the response arrived almost immediately. Brooke handled each inquiry with the same composed confidence she'd shown during the walkthrough, keeping me updated without overwhelming me. I found comfort in her steadiness. It allowed me to focus on the steps rather than the emotions attached to them. The process felt strangely detached, as though I were observing someone else's life from a quiet distance. Within a day, appointments filled the schedule, coordinated back-to-back showings, guiding prospective buyers through the rooms that had once represented the future I thought I was building. I stayed away while strangers evaluated the space. It wasn't avoidance. I simply understood that my presence would only complicate what was now a straightforward transaction. The house had shifted into a different category. No longer personal, not yet someone else's, existing in an in-between state that mirrored the transition happening inside me. Brooke later told me the interest was strong. Chicago buyers were looking for properties like mine, and several parties expressed serious intent. I listened without reacting much, my mind anchored somewhere between relief and disbelief. For years, the house symbolized responsibility. Now it was becoming an exit. One couple stood out among the inquiries: Eric and Melissa Ward. Brooke mentioned their names during a brief update call, describing them as practical, decisive, and already pre-approved. They'd been searching for a property in my neighborhood, specifically drawn by its proximity to work and the kind of stability they wanted for their routines. There was something grounding about hearing that, the thought of the home being taken on by people who valued it for reasons unrelated to obligation. As the showings continued, I returned to my hospital shift, moving through tasks with a clarity that surprised me. The tension that once threaded through my days had thinned. Even the fatigue felt different, not lighter but cleaner, no longer tangled with resentment I tried so hard to ignore. It was during one of these shifts that I finalized the dispute with my credit card company. I documented the unauthorized charge, submitted every required form, and waited while they initiated their review. The temporary credit adjustment appeared in my account hours later. It didn't solve everything, but it marked a step toward reclaiming the control I'd quietly surrendered. Meanwhile, social media painted a different world. Photos from the cruise appeared on Faith's page: expensive meals, polished decks, curated smiles. I scrolled through them without absorbing the details, the images feeling more like advertisements than glimpses into real experience. There was no anger left in me, only kind of distant recognition that they were living a version of luxury I had unknowingly financed for years. By the end of the week, Brooke contacted me with news: Eric and Melissa had submitted an offer. It was clean, competitive, and free of contingencies that might complicate the closing timeline. She broke down the details with her usual professionalism, outlining each element clearly. The offer stood not just as a financial decision, but as confirmation that the transition I envisioned was becoming tangible. I reviewed the documents, carefully before meeting with Brooke to sign. The papers spread across her desk formed a quiet contrast to everything that had led up to this moment. There were no dramatic revelations, no scenes of confrontation, just ink signatures, dates, markers of a change finally taking shape. I signed each page methodically, studying myself, with the knowledge that this step aligned with the direction my life needed to move. When the final signature was complete, Brooke gathered the documents with a nod of satisfaction. The next stages would unfold on a predictable timeline: inspections, confirmations, routine procedures. Nothing chaotic, nothing uncertain. The path forward had been set. The house was officially under contract. The day they returned arrived quietly, marked only by a brief alert on my phone from the realtor's portal confirming the completed transfer of keys. I was between shifts when it came through, standing in the break room with my badge still clipped crookedly to my pocket. There was no anticipation, no dread, just a calm understanding that a point I had been moving toward for years had finally been reached. Across the city, their ride from the airport must have wound through the same streets I had driven countless times. I didn't track their arrival, I only imagined the moment their suitcases rolled across the sidewalk toward the house they assumed still belonged to them. The motion itself carried a kind of symmetry, returning to a place they had claimed as their own without ever acknowledging what it cost me to maintain it. Later, Brooke sent a brief confirmation that the wards had settled in smoothly. They were courteous, appreciative, and excited about their new space. Her message held no dramatic undertone, only the practical assurance of a transaction completed without complication. For them, this was the beginning of a stable chapter. For me, it marked the closure of a door I had kept open far too long. I wasn't there to witness what happened next, but the sequence wasn't hard to picture. They would have walked up to the familiar front steps, expecting the lock to respond to the same key they'd always used. Instead, it would resist, firm and unmistakable. Confusion first, then irritation, then the realization that something had shifted in their absence. Perhaps they would glance at each other before noticing lights inside that didn't match their patterns, shadows moving with the rhythm of unfamiliar routines. Eric would eventually answer the door. He had the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to diffusing tension before it formed, and I imagined him greeting them with polite caution. Melissa, equally gracious, would stand nearby, offer presence that softened the encounter. Their explanation would be straightforward. They had purchased the home during the week, the paperwork was complete, and the transfer had already been finalized. For my family, the moment must have landed with the weight of disbelief. The house they treated as permanent had changed hands without their knowledge. The certainty they once held that my efforts existed to support their comfort no longer applied. I imagined Victor's stare turning sharp, my mother's breath catching, faith shifting restlessly as the implications became clear. There would be questions, accusations, misplaced indignation, but none of it would alter the truth. While they stood on the porch absorbing the fallout of choices they never thought would be challenged, my phone began its relentless vibrations. At first a few calls, then dozens, each one overlapping the next until the notifications blurred together. I didn't answer. I sat on the edge of my bed in the studio apartment and let the phone buzz against the blanket. The sound, muted but persistent, their urgency didn't stir anything in me, except a quiet recognition that this outcome had always been inevitable. Eventually, the vibration stopped. Silence followed, brief and expectant, as though the air were holding its breath. Then the phone lit up again. Call after call, rapid and unyielding. I turned it face down, listening only to the fading echo of what used to hold power over me. The noise longer reached the parts of me it once did. When the final call ended, I picked up the phone.